Now we're just at the top of the hour, and we will be expecting people to arrive in dribs and drabs. What I'll do is I'll do the intro that we tend to like to have as we open our webinars. We need to show some things as well. So welcome to the OpenChain webinar 55. This is a webinar focused on InnerSource. This is going to be a webinar presented by Claire Dillon, the Executive Director of InnerSource Commons. InnerSource is a topic that has become increasingly important, and it's something that we want to unpack more deeply in our community. As with all OpenChain webinars, this webinar is under the Linux Foundation antitrust policy. You are able to read the policy on our website. And if you're from a Linux Foundation member company, you can contact our counsel, Andy Updegrove, with any questions. In short, this is a nice, safe space for people to talk. It's an open event. You can invite anyone inside or outside the Linux Foundation. We like to make sure that communication is open and clear. People should feel free to ask questions and not worry about the level of their knowledge or whether their question is going to be ideal or not. As long as we're on topic, we're all happy, and Claire is a fantastic speaker with enormous amounts of knowledge. If you are watching this recording and you're part of the majority of our audience that does that, please be aware that we will try and support your understanding. If you have questions about any of the language we use or references, just let us know. Well, with that, I'm going to hand over to Claire, who is the world's key expert in InnerSource, to help us understand what this is all about and how we can be part of making it better.
Thank you, Shane, and thank you for the invite to come and speak to the OpenChain community. I'm delighted to be here. But first of all, a clarification. I am absolutely not the world's foremost expert, but I do represent a community of folks who are coming together to learn about InnerSource and to explore this emerging phenomenon, which has been emerging for some time now, but we will go through a little bit of the history in today's presentation. But first of all, I'd like to say I'm delighted to be here today, and thank you so much for the invitation. I will now share my screen, and just hopefully this will all work nice and smoothly. And let's just bring it into presentation mode. And here we are. So I am hoping at this point that you can all see my presentation, and you can shout out if not. At this point in time, I can't see the chat, so I will take all the chat questions after I finish the presentation, and I hope that's okay. But I would like to spend my time here with you today to give an introduction to both InnerSource, its history and what it's all about, and indeed InnerSource Commons, which is the community which I work with, and hopefully you all will come to share and work with in the future if you are interested in following up a little bit more about InnerSource. So to begin with, I wanted to show this slide. Some of you may be familiar with the Gartner hype cycles. Everyone in InnerSource Commons was very delighted last year when we saw this 2022 software engineering Gartner hype cycle, because for the first time, InnerSource actually appeared as an innovation trigger with the Gartner hype cycle. And for us, it was an indication of and a recognition of the fact that InnerSource has actually been growing momentum significantly in the last number of years, and now is emerging as a very popular trend in software engineering. We were delighted to see this appear on the Gartner hype cycle. As you can see, we're just in that emerging area, haven't quite got to the peak of inflated expectations, but we believe that with our community, we can hopefully motor through this curve and bring the community to a greater understanding of how InnerSource can be used to dramatically increase productivity in software engineering. But to go back for a minute to where it all started, well, the InnerSource term itself was coined by Tim O'Reilly back in the early noughties. He was using it to describe the idea of using open source engineering methods inside proprietary organizations. Now, at the time, Tim O'Reilly, when he coined the term, was actually involved in an organization that was helping to teach these kind of methods and practices within organizations. But at the time, InnerSource didn't really take off. And this is probably because even open source itself in the early noughties was still considered with a little bit of perhaps cautiousness by larger organizations. So it wasn't until 2015 that we really started to see InnerSource emerge as a kind of a popular trend within engineering organizations. At that point, Denise Cooper, who is pictured here, spoke at OSCON and talked about the founding of InnerSource Commons. At the time, Denise, who is a long-time open source advocate and expert, she had joined PayPal to head up their open source organization to help them begin to contribute back to the open source community. And at that time, Denise was thinking, well, maybe I need to actually teach them how to do and how to collaborate with the open source community. How do I do that? She looked back to this idea of InnerSource. And because, of course, she herself was an open source advocate, she said, well, if I'm doing this inside PayPal, I might as well do it in the open so that everyone can actually learn from how we're learning in PayPal. So as a result, she founded the InnerSource Commons community to share all the materials and learnings that herself and her team had within PayPal as they moved on this journey towards InnerSource, to help the engineers within PayPal change their culture and practices to get them ready to actually contribute to the open source community. But to do that initially in that safe environment within the organizational boundaries. So if we look to what InnerSource is, we start with what open source is. And of course, everyone here in this community will understand that open source code is visible, can be modified, and can be shared freely. And then InnerSource is essentially software, source code that is visible, can be modified, and can be shared, but behind a firewall. And we have found that works within organizations, or sometimes even between organizations, where folks want to collaborate in an open way, but want to within a kind of a closed garden or a safe space, but to use these open source methods either potentially with a plan to open source the code in the future, or indeed just as a way to actually efficiently collaborate in that kind of closed environment. But as you all know, when we talk about open source, it's not just the end result that's important, it's how it's built and how it's actually collaborated. So when we talk about InnerSource, we're talking about the tools and most importantly, the processes and the culture that surrounds InnerSource communities. And that's what a lot of the conversations in InnerSource Commons are all about. So what changes when we talk about InnerSource? Well, first of all, as mentioned, code becomes visible behind the firewall. But an important, I suppose, point to make here, and because sometimes people assume that means that all code behind the firewall becomes visible, but this actually, within InnerSource, a lot of our participants in the community make sure that this code can become visible, and they can choose to what level it becomes visible, either to the entire organization or perhaps to a smaller community with whom they want to collaborate. Typically, when we change from moving when we change the culture and processes to move to an InnerSource organization, it involves a lot more emphasis on documentation. And as you all know, in the open source community, documentation is so essential to being able to interact with and to contribute to software without necessarily, I suppose, being on the original creator team. So documentation forms this huge, I suppose, focus point for InnerSource practices. Code reviews are, of course, much more formal, and the process behind them needs to be predictable, and a lot of emphasis goes on to how code review happens within an organization in order to be able to enable these external contributions to the source code. So with InnerSource practices, this idea of having third-party teams contribute to the core InnerSource code is a critical part of the practice. We have heard some people use the term InnerSource when they just mean sharing code. But of course, InnerSource and open source practices mean so much more than that. It is this ability to enable this external contribution in a predictable, safe way. And of course, with that comes mentorship. Mentorship is so important, both to the open source community and to the InnerSource community. And again, a lot of the conversations that happen within the InnerSource Commons community is about how we enable and encourage mentorship to happen. And the shared learning is one of the key benefits to InnerSource that's reported from our community members. And then this idea of how do you make the inner source code both visible and findable within an organization. That particular challenge, again, causes a lot of discussion, and we have a lot of ideas about how to do that. So in many respects, when we think about InnerSource and think about enabling open source practices and methods within an organization, we're talking about many of the same topics that are often discussed when we talk about how to enable open source or how to encourage open source or to do great open source. Things like communication, community, documentation, the infrastructure required, the project management required, the licenses required, development process, testing processes, release management, security. All these topics come up when we discuss how to enable InnerSource within an organization. Perhaps, though, the whole license question is the one that's particularly different because, of course, with open source code, you have to think about open source licenses. In the context of InnerSource, we're not talking about open source licenses, but sometimes we do talk about InnerSource licenses, which actually lays out the terms of use and collaboration between perhaps different divisions within an organization, or indeed across legal boundaries within one large overarching organization where some of that definition may need to take place. But in particular, these areas that I've highlighted around communication, community, infrastructure, development process, and security, the conversations, though the topic may be the same, the conversations can differ dramatically when we're talking about InnerSource as opposed to talking about open source. Because, of course, when we're talking about communication channels, there may be many communication channels that already exist within an organization. So it's less about kind of rolling your own, but perhaps integrating in with existing community or communication channels. The idea of how you build community can differ from organization to organization, depending on what the culture is like within that organization. There may be already infrastructure and development processes in place that have to be either modified or amended to actually facilitate InnerSource. And indeed, the security requirements differ from from organization to organization. So again, this is not about when you're creating an open source project, there might be a standard that you would have to adhere to. Within InnerSource, it's perhaps also standards that you might want to adhere to. But of course, also you have to think about the individual organizational policies that may have to be adhered to. And as I mentioned, even with licenses, there are discussions that happen around how InnerSource licenses may be used to clarify the collaboration that might happen between organizations. And that is a trend that we're seeing. It's a focus, for example, for the FinOS InnerSource Special Interest Group. They have been particularly looking at this in the last little while. And in addition to those points, there are two topics that often come up very, very frequently when we talk in the InnerSource community about how to make InnerSource practices work. And that is around incentives and rewards and leadership buy-in. So in the case of doing these sort of practices within an organization, two of the critical levers that people use to make this successful within organizations are in fact using the incentives and reward systems within the organization that may already be in place. You can use those as levers to enhance and to amplify the InnerSource practices. And indeed, it's pretty much recognized that if you're trying any kind of large scale rollout of InnerSource, you have to have leadership buy-in, because so many of the blockers to collaboration can often happen almost implicitly because leadership are not bought in, and therefore policies, procedures, budgetary allocations may actually work counter to your efforts to collaborate. So it's so important to have leadership buy-in if you're trying a large scale rollout of something like InnerSource. So why is it particularly gained momentum in the last number of years? Well, I think one of the first reasons is, of course, because we are seeing the rise of remote and hybrid teams. There was a time when people would have said that the optimal development team might be kind of a pizza-sized team that all work in the same room and have stand-up conversations every morning. And a lot of it is done due to the close physical proximity of the team. And of course, things like the lockdown over COVID has kind of blown that myth, and to let people understand that it is perfectly possible to actually have effective collaborations happen with remote and hybrid teams. This, of course, is something that the open source community always knew, but it is something that it was always perhaps being reacted against from a cultural perspective within organizations, but the COVID lockdown has really proven that this is essentially a great way to potentially build development teams that allows organizations to access talent no matter where they are in their organization, and that you're not confined to having people in one room. You can have folks collaborate from across the organization, drawing on the talent and expertise you need at the time you need it in order to be able to create the best possible software. Secondly, this idea of there not being enough developers in the world. As we all know, there is a shortage of development talent. So when we think about the war on talent, we again want to be able to access the right people in the right places, no matter where they might be. And of course, InnerSource enables this kind of remote asynchronous development that will allow organizations have the flexibility to hire from wherever they need to hire. And indeed, the focus on code reuse and developer productivity has dramatically increased in the last number of years for efficiency reasons. InnerSource and open source, the use of open source practices within organizations has been correlated to increased developer productivity in a number of reports. So it's really great to see, and this is one of the reasons why the interest in InnerSource has actually increased in the last number of years. And so now I'd like to give you a quick overview of InnerSource Commons. I mentioned that Denise Cooper founded the organization back in 2015. And for a number of years, it was a group of, a really vibrant community of folks coming together. But in the last number of years, we've had an explosion of interest in this area. And now we estimate that there are over 2,000 individuals and over 750 organizations who have participated in InnerSource Commons since its inception. I will note that InnerSource Commons operates for the most part under Chatham House rules. We don't force anyone to actually declare their, which organization they're with. So we can't accurately identify exactly how many organizations are part of the community, but we do know from just looking at folks who do declare their affiliations that we've had at least 750 organizations participate in the Commons since its inception. So it's grown dramatically, particularly in the last number of years, aligned with this explosion of interest in InnerSource itself. This is just a little snapshot of our homepage. We have regular community calls, pausing now for the next month for summer holidays, but we'll be starting hopefully again in September. We have 2 a month, some for the Asian Pacific region time zone and some for the European and well, Europe gets to do both, but some for the US time zone as well. And basically when we think about who is hanging out at InnerSource Commons, who participates? Well, we have individual practitioners, those who are actually involved in InnerSource projects themselves. We have this rise of a new audience, the InnerSource program managers, who sometimes sit in open source program offices, but sometimes sit in InnerSource program offices or ISPOs. But we have this in the last, I suppose, 2 years, we've had a rise of folks who are explicitly being tasked with the rollout of InnerSource within their organizations. We have academics and researchers. We have service providers who help folks do their InnerSource practices. But fundamentally, this is a global community with representatives from, I think, over 40 countries. And we have representatives from all verticals, both private and public sector. When we think about what is happening in terms of the working groups, traditionally we've had about 3 active working groups. We've had the Learning Path working group, who creates articles and materials to help folks formally understand InnerSource. We have a very interesting patterns working group, which is where we explore the most recent experiments and practices that people are trying, because this is an evolving practice. So that's where you can find out what's being worked on by our community members in terms of the practices that they're implementing within the organization to try to get to their InnerSource goals. And we have a marketing and outreach working group, which organizes seminars, very like this one. And we were delighted to have OpenChain represented at one of our seminars just this week. But we do community outreach events, we speak at third-party events, we conduct research, and the marketing outreach working group does a lot of that. And most recently, we have started an InnerSource program office working group, which has been a group of individuals who have, that I mentioned before, who have been tasked with rolling out InnerSource broadly within their organization through InnerSource program offices often, and they come together to share materials that they are doing in that corporate-wide rollout. This is as I mentioned, InnerSource Commons itself doesn't ask you to declare your affiliation, but we do keep track of those organizations that talk publicly about their InnerSource practices. And we keep track of those on innersourcecommons.org/stories. Here is just a sample of some of the organizations who have spoken about their InnerSource practices. And we have over 100 references up there. And you're welcome to have a little look at how people are talking about how they are implementing InnerSource and why they're implementing InnerSource there. But to give you some examples, well, the first thing I mentioned was the idea of open source readiness. And indeed, PayPal, the example that kickstarted the Commons, was indeed implementing InnerSource in order to get ready to do open source. We've in fact had some of our participating organizations like Comcast describe how they have actually insisted that any team who wants to open source a project has to InnerSource it successfully first to prove that they have put in place the processes and have the actual competencies in place to deal with external contributions to the source code. So they have to prove that that's being done internally before they are able to actually make that an open source project externally, in order to be able to get that readiness in place in a safe environment. But it's not the only reason why people are interested in InnerSource. So very often these days, we have more and more organizations who are coming to InnerSource just to remove silos. Bosch, who have a very mature and long-lasting InnerSource practice, which was called their internal open source practice, the Bosch internal open source practices, they brought that into place specifically to remove silos between their multiple divisions and to enable that innovation to happen across those divisions. And they've actually reported a dramatic increase in the collaborations and the contributions across organizational boundaries when they brought InnerSource into being. And organizations like Capital One have reported that they actually implemented InnerSource alongside their DevOps rollout. And the reason why they did that was because when they had a centralized DevOps team, they wanted to make sure that all the individual teams that they were working with to build this DevOps pipeline felt that they had their own autonomy to make the changes that they needed to the DevOps pipeline to suit their teams. So in order to be able to be more successful in providing this central service as a DevOps pipeline, they needed to implement InnerSource in order to have that autonomy and great engagement with the teams that they were servicing. And indeed, code reuse and this efficiency idea of actually, rather than actually creating multiple versions of similar functionality, that you can actually reuse the same code again and again, that again comes up as a theme that is a reason why people come to InnerSource. Santander Bank actually released a report where they were talking about the idea that they had an app where before their InnerSource practice, they had actually multiple versions of this app, depending on the region where it was actually being implemented and made available. They decided to use InnerSource to integrate that into one code base. And they had a business case that suggested that it would see 30% efficiency improvements within 2 years. And after 1 year, they were showing that in fact was the case, and that they were seeing those efficiency improvements dramatically occur because they had actually moved to one code base. So that was a great result from their perspective. And indeed, IBM have talked about how they used InnerSource with their Watson AI natural language processing functionality. And because they actually enabled all their partnering teams within IBM to contribute to the Watson NLP core engine, it became the default NLP engine within the organization and enabled them to get that code reuse at a time when almost every team in IBM were investing in their own AI functionality because AI was so popular, is so popular, I should say. But InnerSource has enabled the Watson engine to become the primary NLP engine in use at IBM. And as a result of its success, they are now looking at expanding their InnerSource usage throughout the organization, which is a great win. But another factor, and one that perhaps I feel is perhaps maybe underrepresented when we talk about the value of sharing code, is just the sharing of learning and know-how. Microsoft have a very vibrant InnerSource community. They use it a lot for sharing source code. But the case study that's available on the InnerSource site is actually one that talks about how Microsoft's consulting arm are using InnerSource to create learning materials that they use with their customer. And they emphasize how this has been a grassroots community of practice that's representing global representatives from around the world, and how they are enabled now through InnerSource to take customer feedback at a customer site and have it rolled back into the global materials that are used by the consultancy organization within a very short period of time through InnerSource, because it's all community grassroots driven and doesn't have to go up a chain of command for publication. So using InnerSource, they're actually sharing learnings much more rapidly than they would in the traditional way of command and control publication. And Morgan Stanley indeed talked at one of our community calls about how they were using InnerSource to get build skills in some of their perhaps legacy code, stuff that wasn't perhaps was older mainframe code. They didn't have very many people who were skilled up in that area. So they used InnerSource to help build those skills with a broader community, which helped them build a bigger competency within the organization with this mainframe language and technology. So indeed, things like InnerSource can be used to actually help broaden the actual experience within an organization of a code base. And when you have a critical code base and you want to have a really good pipeline of talent that you know is experienced with that code base, InnerSource can be a great way to build that. And indeed, it's always worth noting that it's well recognized that in today's trends, young graduates are very much used to experienced in kind of collaborating in a very open way. When they come into organizations, they want to see that kind of culture happen within those organizations that they have experienced through their own academic careers. And so they're much more likely to stick around when they have that autonomy to be able to collaborate and to learn and to be, I suppose, connected with projects throughout the organization. And I say that, referencing the youth and the younger generation, but actually that same need is within, I think, every generation. It's just that we have never necessarily had that in corporate organizations where there have been strict silos put in place, perhaps through artificial reasons. And with InnerSource, it breaks down those silos and enables everyone to have this learning community and to be able to build skills across the organization and gain experience with projects that may not be in your own domain. And that can be a great, great benefit. So in summary, InnerSource helps to reduce silos and waste in terms of repeated effort. It actually has been reported to improve developer velocity and productivity, and ultimately, it makes developers happier and improves their skills. And of course, we all want to make developers happier. That would be a nicer world to be in. So it's one of the reasons why, or some of the reasons why, InnerSource has gained popularity in the last little while. So with that, I'll just say, if you are interested in learning more, please do come join us at innersourcecommons.com. You can join the Slack channel. We have mailing lists, and as I said, every 2 weeks we have a community call starting again September. But we would be delighted to see you over the community if you'd like to learn more or discuss more about this. And with that, I will stop sharing and go back and have a little look at chat and see what questions we might have.
Thank you, Claire. We actually had a pretty active series of discussions going on. So we had our good friend, Guilherme, in the talk, answering the questions live. So you have
Thank you, Guilherme.
The community. We do have a question from Ninjoji-san over at Toshiba. 2 questions. What are the things to consider, and what are the best practices when a company with developers has offices in different countries, or a group company has multiple legal entities? And that's really, I think, coming from our background with things like compliance, where having these offices or different entities means you're actually transferring cross-org from a legal perspective. So how do you InnerSource when you're outering code?
Yes, no, thank you for that, and it's a great question, and one I would expect from this community. What I will point folks to is the discussions in the InnerSource Commons community around transfer pricing. So this has been an issue that has been raised by organizations who have this particular concern about transferring IP across legal boundaries, and as such, there is a body of knowledge now emerging around the idea of how to set up your organization in order to be able to effectively manage manage transfer pricing in that scenario. So I'm not going to go into it now because it is quite involved in terms of the many different ways that people can set up their organizations. But I will say, and I can point to them afterwards if you'd like, there are some great talks from our previous summits and community calls around transfer pricing and the most recent practices that have been put in place by organizations in order to be able to facilitate InnerSource in that context. It's been a topic that is in particularly, I suppose, it's been a particular topic that's been popular within for some reason, our European community, perhaps due to the folks that are actually more set up perhaps differently and more traditionally within that context. Not so much for the larger tech companies in the US, but it's a very vibrant topic of conversation for some of our organizations in Europe.
Now, we had a side question just come in on the chat where someone was just asking that, they can't unmute and so on. Is that by design? On this call, it is by design. We'll focus the questions on the chat. If there's someone, of course, I recognize from our community pre-existing, they can talk, but we will have a few people here who are not necessarily known to us. And we had a trawl in the pre-start session. So we're keeping it to chat only. But please do put your questions there. Claire, I've got a question. In China, I noticed more people are talking about InnerSource now. So for instance, I met Jerry Tan and he was telling me he advocates for InnerSource a lot in China and it's going well. I was wondering to what extent that has moved into also working with, for instance, the government. So a quick example is that we have a situation in OpenChain where we have people working with us in the certification from agencies like CAICT and CESI. Now, this is certification. It's very different to advocacy and education per se, but it's there. And I was just wondering if you found the same kind of formal engagement, or if, because this is a methodology approach as opposed to a spec approach, it's primarily the companies working with you on this.
So it's a really interesting question, and it's great that you've met Jerry. And of course, as Guilherme is pointing out, we also have a very active community in Japan as well. So some of our members are very involved there. So definitely check it out. But with regard to governments and InnerSource, it's a really interesting one. We have seen a number of government organizations more recently be interested in InnerSource for two main reasons. One is where they may want to collaborate in an open way and want a kind of a framework for collaborating that allows, so they want to collaborate, they want to share their source code between, say, maybe security agencies across national borders, but don't necessarily want that code to be visible to the world. So in that scenario, we have seen a number of organizations come to us and talk about the idea of, how do we use InnerSource to enable that sort of collaboration. The second reason why folks in government are interested in InnerSource is the same thing that I talked about in terms of Comcast. It's when they know that they have an intent to open source it at the end, but because they're government agencies, they are particularly cautious about putting things out that are too early. So if things have not been built to a level of what they consider to be maturity in terms of security or in terms of their own acceptance that this is the right approach, perhaps they may have multiple projects doing things, experimenting with different approaches, but haven't quite decided which the end version will be, then they may want to actually implement InnerSource to be able to do that initially in a closed environment with the intent to open source it later, but building up all the kind of the infrastructure and the competencies about how to actually engage with external contributions while that's going on, so that at the very end they can flick a switch and it's not such a culture shock to go from being a kind of a traditionally built piece of software to actually going to the open source community, but it's more like a flick of a switch to say, well, now we're opening it to everyone, but we have all our processes in place, we have the competencies in place, we have the documentation in place, we have everything in place that we know is ready, and now we're making it open to the public. I've even seen it in scenarios where people may want to open it to limited members of the public, perhaps in some instances to, for example, comply with Freedom of Information Acts. For in some jurisdictions, software can come under Freedom of Information. So governments are using it in all those cases, alongside the more traditional benefits that I talked about in terms of developer productivity and velocity, where they're trying to just break down silos and get government folks collaborating across perhaps department boundaries, for example.
That makes a lot of sense. And To be clear, most of our community, the vast majority is corporate. It's just that we've noticed that some governments are very keen on engaging. So for instance, they started citing our standards in Japanese government policy, the Chinese government and various agencies affiliated with Department of Trade are beginning to become certifiers. So we can't say that we've got some magic bullet to move entire governments, but it is vital, of course, that those parties know how to use InnerSource, how to advocate InnerSource, because it's one side of the picture of modern software development. So if there's anything we can collaborate on through our channels so that they include that in all of their messaging, I'd love to do so.
That sounds
Yeah. Sorry, my apologies. Go ahead.
No, that sounds great. I think from our perspective, I think what seems to be emerging is that I think the world is beginning to wake up to this idea of responsible collaborative development. Of course, the OpenChain project is such an important part of that. I do think we all are battling against what can sometimes be a myth around collaborative development or open source development, that it's kind of a free-for-all, that it's kind of like, you make it open and everyone will just, pile in with their community contributions and it'll all be good. And I was accused once of being too much about unicorns and rainbows and collaborative development, but fundamentally, I think, putting these responsible practices in place, it's not a free-for-all. It's when we're talking about great software development, it should be collaborative, but it should have these best practices put in place, like OpenChain and other standards, to help people understand how to build in a scalable, sustainable way great software.
Right.
But make them happier while they're doing it.
Happy can be good. We've got a couple of questions in. Leonard. Hey, Leonard, one of my board members, BMW, said, as I understand, this is the right way, define the project you want to InnerSource, and then the source code will be open to all, or will it be a limited number of coworkers? So Leonard's question is, when you define your InnerSource project, do you open the code to everyone inside the company or to a limited number? Wild guess, it depends. But Claire, you're the expert.
That's a great answer. It's so often the answer. Yes, indeed, it depends. It depends on your goals. So we've had organizations who have defined an InnerSource project from the get-go and have deliberately made that open to everyone in order to be able to create, a kind of a company-wide contribution where it enables people to self-discover the actual code and then use it. And the intent is to potentially get some shared service used as widely as possible. So that might be the scenario in that pattern. There may be other situations where one group wants to collaborate with a small number or one other group, and they want to facilitate that collaborating happening, but they may not want to open it to the entire company. That also happens. We've seen that pattern emerge. And then we've also had the scenario where you've had an existing code base, which hasn't been InnerSourced, become InnerSourced because of any one or more of those particular scenarios I talked about. Maybe even some legacy code that was built, 40 odd years ago now decides to become InnerSourced. So that has not been done, from the origin of the project, but there are steps that people go through then to enable the team to both have it documented correctly and indeed put the processes in place to be able to handle external contributions. That often is that kind of culture practice change we talked about, and getting people used to doing mentorship and reviewing code in a formal way, and even the kind of communication style that has to happen between external contributors who may be not familiar with the code and experts. How that all happens within an organization can often form a lot of the challenges that are in place. So any of the above scenarios may happen, but indeed, I suppose the difference between open source and InnerSource is that ability to actually have your choice of how much you open it is there with InnerSource. I've heard it described as a rolling wall of openness. So you can decide to have it quite close to being closed or all the way to nearly being open, or but InnerSource can cover that gamut between closed, open. It's not just a switch. You can have a rolling wall of openness.
Which is interesting because, you begin to see people experimenting with concepts like this around open source as well, or open source adjacent. I said open source adjacent because let's just take Meta's new licensing of their LLM that came out a day or two ago. Their license is almost open source, except if you have more than 700 million users, where you need a special license, and except you're not allowed to train someone else's large language model with their large language model. So, that's not falling under an open source definition, but it's very close to it. And it's clear that there's some thinking there happening in the industry as a whole regarding internal and external use of code, of how to set different types of boundary. And in, let's say, open source, that's going to be a very hot topic. It's going to be chewed on for a while. But the fact that the thinking is in play, I think, isn't an unhealthy thing to think about, especially given that the open source concepts that sparked all of this and the free software concepts that sparked it stretch back many decades. And we're in a very different situation now to what we were in 1984 or 1998.
No, indeed, and just from my perspective, the ability to, one of the reasons why I think it can be a benefit is because the idea of InnerSource can address some of the concerns that people have, where they put blockers in place to outright ban open source. It's kind of like, well, we couldn't do in open source because A, B, and C. Now, InnerSource can help them get on that journey, potentially even experiment with opening more in, as I said, in that kind of safe environment, helps them get comfortable, particularly those folks that would be the naysayers, the blockers to open sourcing. It can help them get on the journey, understand that they're able to do that, even have all their kind of policies and processes ticked internally, so that they feel so comfortable that that step to open sourcing feels like a very small step instead of a huge leap. And I think that can be the real benefit, to actually get both more people comfortable with open source and more people skilled in developing in that open source way. And both can only have benefits to the broader open source community, and hope and ultimately expand the number of open source projects and talented developers out there.
Now, we actually have a very nice related question, which comes from Sharif, which are there any inner source license templates available, or was there any discussion in the community about this?
Well, I would point them to the very explicit work that's going on, as I said, in the FINOS, the Financial Open Source Foundation. They have an InnerSource special interest group, and they are explicitly right now involved in building an InnerSource license template generator, which actually allows you to put in your company's criteria, and out will pop a template InnerSource license. So that work is going on right now. But if you're particularly interested, again, I'll share some of the details with that for your community later, just so that folks can follow up on that.
And in the chat as well, there's some notes about how InnerSource projects can work. There's a link to something about contained InnerSource that was just posted.
Yes, that's again Guilherme. It's fantastic having Guilherme on the call. He's pumping out all the actual links to the resources. Thank you, Guilherme, again. So this is one of these patterns that I mentioned, and the pattern work is incredibly valuable in terms of answering these very particular pointy little questions. So in that particular pattern, you can have a look at how folks are actually defining the actual contribution criteria, and how you can actually limit that in cases depending on how many people you want contributing, whether or not they need to actually presumably get to a particular point of, say, for example, security compliance or anything like that, or they may need to do some training before they have access to the source code, whatever that may be. People are actually now starting to put that into the contribution.md file, so that people can kind of get an expectation of whom and how they want to actually get, how they want to get contributions into their source code.
Now, this is a side note, but OpenChain is also increasingly working on collaboration with FINOS. So we'll be working on how we can contribute to what they're up to and try to make sure we're aligned with them. I bring this up because right now the OpenChain project is currently noodling on what do we do next. We have the potential to build a family of standards. We have a tabled proposal for expanding on contribution. So we have a contribution section in our compliance standard which says, think about it, have a policy for it, and have a process for it. And we left it at that. And people are now saying, well, we're building contribution processes, we could do it more process guidance. So we're noodling on, do we make another standard on contribution? And just putting this on the table as a blue sky, I have not socialized this with Claire, but we probably need to also swing back to you and talk about, if a company is making a contribution policy, that contribution policy inherently from our original optic is outward facing, but not necessarily. So maybe we can try to incorporate some of the inner source concepts if we move ahead with a contribution specification. So a company makes a contribution concept that might be under the auspices of an OSPO or an inner source program office that could deal with internal and external contribution. In other words, for the people who ask the question about licenses and templates, sort of before you get to your license, you often have to think about what is the context of what we're doing, what are the parameters, and then you get to what is the license that enables this and contains it. So maybe there's stuff we can do together there, just flagging that we're actively looking at new standards, and this is something contribution is on the table. And contribution external to entities is not that different from contribution internal, when you're talking about your process management, risk containment, and just making sure that the spaghetti monster of chaos is not completely hidden under the carpet, but you can unravel it when it's audit time.
I think that sounds absolutely excellent. And indeed, it would be a great addition to our own, patterns around contribution and the contribution.md pattern template to actually even reference this area that you're talking about, that folks can actually go and I suppose include within their own guidelines, internal guidelines. So it would be mutually beneficial, I think. And I will as well note, because we've heard again, one of the benefits. This is just something that just popped into my mind when you were talking about unraveling the spaghetti and getting those great practices in place, even internally before you go externally. We have had feedback. In the early days, there were a lot of folks saying, "Oh, our CISO, our security officer, will never allow InnerSource to happen. Like that's just going to be too risky. Where we let anyone, contribute to this code. What might they do? What might they see?" And interestingly, in many organizations, we're getting feedback from those organizations, the CISO organizations, the security organizations, that InnerSource can actually be more deliberate about and allow the organization to be more deliberate about those policies for internal collaboration. And not only that, because there is such a focus on documentation within InnerSource, not just in terms of documenting the READMEs and the contribution.mds and all that sort of thing, but also storing the communication between contributors and the originating team, that wealth of knowledge can be hugely important when it comes to auditing. And so when that is in place in a formal manner, it can actually dramatically increase the auditability and the governance around software development. And having that archive there as well is so important from an InnerSource perspective, but has that additional knock-on benefits from that security and auditability perspective. So there's a lot of, I think, great synergy there.
Oh yeah. And one thing that comes into play, I think, is the timeline optics. Something like the OpenChain project, ISO standards, we're thinking many years to decades. So whenever we're thinking about process management, we're really thinking about when the next generation is having a look at this, is there any note here? And this puts us in a very different position from, let's say, high velocity projects, CNCF. Their big thing is changing the cloud landscape right now. And this also means that when we drift into an area and we look at something like InnerSource, we're inherently looking at the long-term value to massive corporations putting this in play and affecting thousands of suppliers. And InnerSource is a clear win. So, for us, the question is, how do we communicate it more and more? And I think this presentation was really useful to get some of that context. One thing I do have a question on, and I don't see another question in the chat, so I get to ask a question. If companies watching this are interested in going far beyond simply learning, but supporting, let's say, InnerSource Commons, if they want to help underwrite some of the advocacy around the world. As was pointed out earlier, there's an active Japan community already, but in other jurisdictions, etc., if companies want to lean in and help, I notice we've got China Mobile on this call. How do they do so? What type of actions can they take to work with you? Is it the same as OpenChain where they can just turn up and start playing together? Are there formal processes, etc.?
Well, thank you for that question. And I suppose I should start by saying that the most valued contribution that we see at InnerSource Commons is people's time and expertise. So there are many different ways for individuals and organizations to help build the body of knowledge around InnerSource, to discuss the challenges, document the potential practices and patterns, and create learning materials. We have a very active community translating a lot of our actual learning materials into different languages. The entire body of our learning path content and our website and everything has recently been translated to Japanese, for example, by our Japanese community. So there are many different opportunities for folks to actually contribute without any boundaries or any constraints at all. If organizations do want to take a more formal role in supporting InnerSource Commons, there are also formal supporter and partnership opportunities, and we have a number of organizations who are our partners and our supporters, and we really value their support. They help us do what we do. We're an interesting organization because unlike some of the other foundations, our members of the organization are the membership of the organization is awarded to folks who actually contribute their time and expertise to the organization, and those members are in fact kind of like shareholders of the organization, but we do really value the corporate and the other organizational support that some of the big companies and smaller companies indeed can offer the Commons. So if you're interested in that, please do reach out to me. I'm Claire at innersourcecommons.org, and I'd be delighted to share the options with you.
Great. I mean, it's always a very realistic question of how do we help support this? And I mean, I talked about high velocity projects like CNCF. They have oodles of money compared to OpenChain because what they're doing is super cool and drives billions upon billions of dollars of revenue. And we're doing something kind of archaic. I mean, we make lawyers happy in procurement.
An
So
important job.
it's very important. We're looking at cross-domain core things that affects every industry vertical. What we're doing, what you're doing. But it's important to have roots for companies to lean in, and those that are thinking we're going to take that strategic play, we're going to take that item because we know it's a long-term thing, to know that they can send you a mail and get this conversation underway. I've mentioned this before, but of course I'm also going to ask you to give a brief talk sometime to our board, so those 25 as well will be able to kick the tires and ask questions. I really do want to work on this collaboration. I think this is the other half of the mirror from the external open source side that we need to address. So I hope this and my previous webinar are very much the beginning of a conversation.
I hope so too. And thank you once again for inviting me on. I look forward to collaborating in the future with this great community.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you, wonderful audience. And thank you to everyone asking questions and answering questions as well. We've had a very busy chat. Take care all. Have a beautiful day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.